Have you ever wondered what happened to the great hunters of the plains when luck turned away from them and the prairie became empty? We are used to imagining Native Americans as proud horsemen chasing countless herds of bison, but history is silent about what these people ate during periods of total famine. The reality of survival in the wild was far from romantic, and sometimes the only salvation was something that modern man would not even consider food. The Great Plains, stretching from Missouri to the Rocky Mountains, could be both a generous provider and a merciless desert, condemning entire tribes to search for food under their feet. The Lakota, Cheyenne, and other peoples honed the art of finding calories in tree bark, hard seeds, and even their own clothing over centuries. Their knowledge of nature was so profound that they could extract energy from stones and dry grass when hunting was impossible. This aspect of their lives was full of incredible ingenuity, patience, and a deep understanding of the hidden resources of the world around them. Watch the video to the end, and you will learn how the preparation of ordinary broth turned into a complex technological process of extracting the last fat from dried bones. What if I told you that the main suppliers of food during the hungry years were not people, but those who are usually overlooked? In harsh times when bison hunting was unsuccessful, the tribe's survival depended on unobvious sources of food. At such times, Native American women turned their gaze to the ground, knowing full well that rich reserves were hidden beneath it. They understood that nature had already taken care of preserving energy, only it had done so with someone else's hands. Or more accurately, paws. Small field rodents lived in the lowlands and river valleys where the soil remained soft and loose. They were tireless workers who spent the entire autumn exclusively preparing provisions for the winter. These little creatures diligently collected seeds, nuts, and especially valuable ground beans. They stored them in neat underground pantries, insulated with dry grass. In essence, these were ready-made food stores hidden right under their feet. Finding such a storehouse was a real art, requiring incredible observation skills and knowledge of the habits of the local fauna. Women had to read the tracks on the ground, as well as a tracker reads the tracks of an animal. For their search, they took with them special tools that they cherished and passed down from generation to generation. These were digging sticks made from the hardest types of wood and specially hardened in fire for strength. The search process usually began with a careful examination of the area in river floodplains or forest edges. It was there, among the thickets of shrubs and tall grass, that rodents most often made their hiding places. An experienced eye could spot barely visible signs of habitation that were inaccessible to the average person. Tiny burrows or barely noticeable mounds of loosened earth indicated the entrance to the coveted underground storage. When luck smiled on the seekers, the results could exceed all expectations. Sometimes they managed to find hiding places containing several kilograms of selected seeds and tubers, already cleaned of their husks. It was a real gift of fate, capable of feeding a large family for several days or even weeks. Rodents chose only the best fruits, so the quality of such food was very high. However, even in such moments of extreme need and hunger, people did not forget the harsh laws of balance. People did not consider themselves kings of nature who could rob the weak with impunity. There was a strict unspoken rule that all gatherers obeyed. It was never permissible to take all the supplies, condemning the little owner of the burrow to certain starvation in winter. The Indians firmly believed that greed was punishable. They believed that if they took all the supplies down to the last grain, the spirits of the earth would be angry with people. As punishment, they would never again give them luck in finding food, and the tribe would suffer real hunger. Therefore, relations with nature were based not on plunder, but on the principles of mutual respect. When taking ground beans or nuts, women always left something in return, making a kind of honest exchange. Often, they would put a cob of dried corn or a piece of fat in the slightly emptied pantry. Sometimes they left other food that was even more caloric for the animal than what they took. This allowed the mice to survive the cold without wasting energy on new searches. This was not just a beautiful ritual or superstition, but a very pragmatic approach to survival. Such care allowed the population of these useful harvesters to be preserved for the next year. If the mouse survives, it will harvest again, which can be used again in difficult times. The ground beans themselves, known popularly as mouse beans, were an extremely nutritious food. The taste of these wild beans was somewhere between the familiar peanut and bean. However, they had a much denser and firmer texture. It was almost impossible to eat them raw, and they were not particularly tasty. Therefore, before consumption, these beans required careful and lengthy cooking. First, the harvest was soaked in water for a long time, sometimes changing the water several times. This was necessary to soften the hard outer layer and remove any dirt. Then came the cooking stage, which was a very laborious process in the field. The beans were cooked in thick leather bags or clay pots, if they were available. To bring the water to a boil, stones heated on a fire were thrown into the container, constantly replacing the cooled ones with hot ones. During the long cooking process, the tough skin that floated to the surface of the water was removed from the beans. As a result, only the soft and very nutritious pulp remained. The resulting thick puree was mixed with a small amount of bison fat, if it was available. Sometimes this dish was eaten on its own, without any additives, enjoying the heartiness of the product. It was rich in vegetable protein and starch, which provided the necessary strength and energy. It was this kind of food that helped the body generate heat and survive the cold winter months when calories were worth their weight in gold. Surprisingly, these little underground treasures were highly valued not only in times of famine. They were considered a real delicacy even in times of plenty, when there was plenty of meat. Some tribes had special legends praising the hard work of field mice and their invaluable help to humans. The search for such storerooms turned into a kind of quiet hunt, exciting and thrilling. The trophy in this hunt was not meat and skins, but pure, high-quality vegetable protein. It is important to note that this method of obtaining food was available even in winter in deep snow. All you needed was to know the exact locations of the burrows and have a good memory. This knowledge was carefully passed down from mother to daughter, from generation to generation. The women of the tribe formed a detailed map of resources in their minds, completely invisible to the outside eye. Where an outsider saw only a snow-covered field, a local woman saw hidden food supplies. Thus, thanks to their observation skills and deep respect for nature, the tribes were able to survive the most difficult periods. They survived even when huge herds of bison disappeared far beyond the horizon. We would be very interested to hear your opinion. If you found yourself in the wilderness, would you resort to searching for other people's food supplies as a means of obtaining food? Please share your thoughts in the comments. Are you ready to learn the truth that trees can be not only a building material, but also food? In the harshest times, when supplies were running low and the ground was frozen so hard that it was impossible to dig, people looked up at the trunks of pine and aspen trees. The inner bark of some trees, known as cambium, became a life-saving source of carbohydrates and sugar. This was not just a desperate measure, but the use of ancient knowledge about the properties of the plants surrounding the camp. Ponderosa pine was particularly prized, as its inner layer of bark had a sweet taste and was rich in nutrients. The process of harvesting the bark was laborious and required special tools, usually made of horn or bone. First, the rough outer layer of bark, which was inedible and tough, was removed from the tree. Underneath it was a moist, fibrous layer of white or cream color. This was the coveted cambium. Women cut it into long strips, trying not to damage the wood too deeply so as not to destroy the tree, if possible. Fresh cambium was juicy and sweet, tasting like raw syrup with a hint of pine. It could be eaten right there, which children and gatherers often did to regain their strength. However, most often the harvested bark was stored for future use, undergoing further processing. The strips of cambium were boiled in water until they turned into a jelly-like mass. This process could take several hours, requiring constant maintenance of the fire and replacement of the stones in the water. The boiled bark became softer and easier for the body to digest, giving a feeling of fullness. Sometimes it was dried in the sun or over the smoke of a fire, turning it into hard plates that could be stored for months. In this form, the bark became light and compact, convenient for transportation during transitions. Dried bark could be ground into flour using stone grain grinders or mortars. This flour was added to soups to thicken them or mixed with water to make porridge. Although such food was not as high in calories as meat, It contained important trace elements and vitamin C, which protects against scurvy. Tribes living in forested mountains used aspen bark, which, although more bitter, also saved them from starvation. The taste of aspen bark was more astringent, but prolonged cooking removed the bitterness, leaving only a starchy base. Traces of this food gathering can still be found in the old forests of North America. Trees with characteristic scars from removed bark, known as culturally modified trees, stand as living monuments to the resilience of indigenous peoples. These scars, covered with resin, tell a story of times of need and ingenuity. For Native Americans, trees became a source of sustenance in the truest sense of the word. They were a resource that was always at hand, even when everything else was hidden under snow. In addition to pine and aspen, the inner bark of elm and maple trees, which was also rich in sugars, was used for food. In spring, when sap flow began, the nutritional value of the cambium increased significantly. People knew this cycle and tried to harvest the bark during this period if supplies allowed them to wait until spring. This knowledge of the seasons was critical to the survival of entire communities. Thus, the forest became a huge granary, the keys to which were held by those who knew how to look beyond the rough outer shell. In the next chapter, you will learn how ancient cooks extracted the most valuable product from what we usually throw away to dogs. Want to know a secret that will change your perception of efficiency? When an animal carcass was eaten and the meat was gone, the bones remained, which to modern humans are nothing more than waste. But for the indigenous peoples of the plains, bones were a storehouse of the most valuable resource in cold conditions: pure fat. Extracting bone fat was not just a culinary skill, but a complex technological process that required enormous patience and labor. It allowed every available calorie to be extracted from the hunted animal, leaving nothing to chance. The process began with the large bones of bison, deer, or moose being carefully cleaned of meat and tendons. Then they had to be broken into small pieces to expose the internal structure of the bone. Heavy stone hammers and flat anvil stones were used for this purpose, turning the bones into practically powder. This work was physically demanding and monotonous, often performed by women and the elderly near the fire. The crushed bones were placed in large leather bags or special depressions in the ground lined with skins. Then began the extraction, or boiling, stage, which was a real art. The bone crumbs were placed in water, which was brought to a boil with the help of hot stones. As it heated, the fat began to melt out of the porous structure of the bones and float to the surface of the water. It was important to maintain the temperature, but not to allow vigorous boiling so that the fat did not mix with the water to form an emulsion. The gatherers carefully removed the floating fat with special spoons made of horn or shells, trying not to scoop up water. The resulting product, called bone oil or bone fat, was incredibly nutritious and high in calories. It was white or cream-colored and had a firm consistency when cooled, resembling modern butter. This fat could be stored for a very long time, did not go rancid, and was the basis for making pemmican, the main camping food. Pure bone fat was valued even more than regular lard, as it had a more delicate flavor and texture. In the harsh winter conditions, it was this fat that provided energy to warm the body and maintain strength. The bone broth left over after cooking was not wasted either. It was drunk or used as a base for soups. The boiled bones themselves, which had become brittle and white, could be used to make small tools or fertilizer. This waste-free technology demonstrated a deep respect for the hunt and an understanding of the value of resources. The Indians knew that the animal's life force was hidden in the bone marrow and knew how to extract it. It was fuel that allowed the body to function at extremely low temperatures. A mountain of bones was required to obtain a small amount of this oil, making it a product of high status and importance. It was reserved for the sick, the elderly, and children, as well as for warriors going on long journeys. The taste of this oil was rich and enveloping, and it instantly satisfied hunger. Often a spoonful of this fat dissolved in hot water with herbs was the only food for the whole day. If you haven't liked us yet, do it now to support our channel and the release of new survival stories. What if I told you that one of the most terrifying natural disasters for farmers was a real feast for nomads? I'm talking about large-scale invasions of locusts, Mormon crickets, and grasshoppers. These events periodically swept across the Great Plains and the arid territories of the Great Basin. The swarms of insects were so huge that they literally blocked out the sun and turned day into twilight. To farmers, it looked like a biblical plague, destroying all the greenery in its path. But for the indigenous peoples of America, this phenomenon had a completely different meaning. For Native Americans, it was an unexpected source of pure protein that flew or crawled right into their hands. In harsh conditions, when hunting large game such as bison or deer was unsuccessful, such invasions saved lives. Insects instantly became a strategic resource that allowed entire tribes to survive. Nature took away the grass, but in return gave food in another form. Insect gathering was not a chaotic hunt, but a well-organized community event. Absolutely all members of the community participated, from small children who had just learned to walk to the elderly. Usually, work began very early in the morning, before sunrise. At this time, the air in the steppe was still cold, and the insects were numb from the night chill. They were sluggish and sat densely on the grass and branches of bushes, unable to fly or run away. In these morning hours, the prey was the easiest to catch. People simply shook the numb insects into woven baskets or leather bags, like berries from a bush. In this simple way, it was possible to collect kilograms of live biomass in literally a matter of hours. When the sun rose and the insects became more active, the tactics changed. The Indians moved on to more complex methods of collective hunting. One such method involved organizing a large-scale drive. People would line up in a long chain, covering a large area of the field, and begin to drive the insects in a certain direction. They were driven towards a long trench or deep pit dug in advance. To speed up the process and direct the flow in the right direction, they often used fire and thick smoke from bundles of grass. The insects, fleeing from the heat, rolled down into the prepared trap like an avalanche. In such a pit, it was possible to collect a huge harvest at once. Once the prey was trapped, it had to be processed quickly before the insects scattered. The collected grasshoppers and crickets were usually roasted immediately. For this purpose, hot coals from a fire or heated flat stones were used. Heat treatment served several purposes at once. First, the fire quickly burned off the hard wings and prickly legs, which were unsuitable for food. Second, frying gave the product a pleasant, crunchy texture and killed any possible parasites. Only the nutritious bodies remained, extremely rich in healthy fats and pure protein. Properly roasted grasshoppers tasted like nuts, and to some they resembled fried shrimp. It was a perfectly edible and even tasty dish that was appreciated by many prairie gourmets. They were often eaten hot as a quick snack to satisfy hunger during the harvest. It was like eating seeds or nuts by the campfire during a break. However, the main goal was not immediate satisfaction. The main task was to stock up on this valuable resource for the long and hungry winter period. For long-term storage, the roasted insects were subjected to additional processing. They were carefully dried in the sun, spread out in a thin layer on skins or stones. It was necessary to achieve complete evaporation of moisture so that the product became brittle and dry. Then the dry carcasses were ground into a fine powder using stone grain grinders or pestles. The result was a high-calorie flour rich in protein. This flour was poured into thick leather bags, where it could be stored for months without losing its properties. It did not mold or spoil if moisture did not get into the bag. In winter, when fresh meat was scarce, this preparation was actively used in cooking. It was added to thick meat soups for broth or used to make porridge. This flour was often mixed with melted fat and dried berries. This mixture was used to make nutritious briquettes or cakes similar to the famous pemmican. Such food was extremely concentrated and provided a lot of energy in a very small volume. A small piece was enough to keep a hunter or warrior full for half a day. Some tribes of the Great Basin, such as the Shoshone and Paiute, were so successful at this that they earned special nicknames. Their neighbors often called them grasshopper eaters, which was not meant as an insult, but rather a statement of fact. For these peoples, insects were not just a last resort when there was nothing else to eat. They were an important and expected part of the seasonal diet, for which they prepared in advance. Modern analysis shows that the Indians were absolutely right in their choice. In terms of protein, iron, and healthy fats, insects are on par with, and sometimes even surpass, high-quality beef. They were excellent game that did not need to be tracked for days and killed with a well-aimed arrow. All you had to do was bend down and pick them up, with a little patience. Paradoxically, periods of pest infestations, which we consider a disaster, became times of satiety and abundance. The Indians did not experience the disgust that was characteristic of Europeans. They perceived insects as another generous gift of nature, sent to sustain the life of the tribe. The ability to quickly switch from bison meat to grasshoppers was an example of the incredible adaptability of their culture. It was this flexibility of mind and habits that allowed people to survive in the most extreme conditions. Where European settlers, constrained by their food prejudices, died of hunger, the locals thrived. Nature provided food in the most unexpected and strange forms. The task of humans was simply to be able to accept and use it. Do you think modern humans would be able to overcome their cultural barriers and squeamishness for the sake of survival? In the northernmost regions and subarctic forests, where winter lasted most of the year, there was a product that literally grew on rocks. Lichens, especially a species known as rock scar, or tripe de roche, became the last hope for travelers and hunters. These were tough, leathery growths of black or gray color, tightly attached to granite boulders. At first glance, they seemed completely inedible and resembled dried paint or dirt. However, the Cree and Athabascan peoples knew that life was hidden inside these unassuming plants. Collecting lichen was easy, as it was available at any time of year and did not hide under snow on vertical cliffs. It was scraped off with knives or torn off by hand, filling bags with a dry, brittle mass. But eating it raw was impossible and even dangerous due to its caustic acids, which caused severe stomach upset. The secret to turning lichen into food lay in proper and lengthy processing. Knowledge of the preparation technology separated satiety from severe poisoning. First, the collected lichen had to be thoroughly washed and soaked in water, often with the addition of ash to neutralize the bitterness and acidity. This process could take a day, requiring patience and a large amount of water. After soaking, the lichen became soft and slippery, resembling wet rags or seaweed. Then it was cooked slowly over low heat until it began to break down and thicken. The result was a thick, slimy mass, similar to paste or jelly. The taste of this dish was specific, earthy, and slightly bitter. But when hot, it warmed you up well. The main value of lichen was its ability to swell in the stomach, creating a feeling of fullness. Fish, oil, or caviar was often added to this soup to increase its calorie content and improve its taste. For people exhausted by hunger, a plate of hot lichen stew was a real salvation. History knows many examples when entire expeditions of European explorers survived only because local guides prepared this dish for them. Lichen was a reliable reserve that never ran away or hid. It grew wherever there were rocks and moisture, serving as an omnipresent supply for a rainy day. It was food of desperation, but it fulfilled its main function. It sustained life. Are you ready for the shocking truth about what happened when even insects and bark ran out? There was a resource that people carried with them or used in their daily lives without even thinking about its edibility until a certain moment. We are talking about rawhide, a material used to make clothes, moccasins, parfleche bags, and teepee coverings. In essence, it was processed and dried animal skin that retained protein, albeit in a very tough form. When hunger became unbearable, everyday items were turned into food. This decision was made only in the most extreme cases, when death seemed inevitable. Women took old bags, pieces of spare leather, or even moccasin soles if they were made of untreated rawhide. Leather tanned with smoke and brains was unsuitable for food due to chemical changes in taste. But simple bison or deer hides dried in the sun were still organic. The first step was to clean the piece of leather of dirt and wool by singeing it over a fire. Then the pieces of skin, which were as hard as plywood, were cut into small strips and boiled. Boiling could take an eternity, hours, sometimes even days, until the collagen in the skin began to break down. The water turned into a cloudy, sticky broth, and the pieces of skin themselves became soft and rubbery. Such food was difficult to chew and had virtually no taste except for a slight hint of animal glue. But it was protein that the body could absorb and convert into energy for the heart and lungs to work. The psychological aspect of such nutrition was difficult. People were essentially eating their homes and their clothes. It was a symbol of complete depletion of resources, a line beyond which lay emptiness. Nevertheless, the history of the Plains tribes preserves memories of harsh winters when it was the old parfleche that saved families. This moccasin soup became a metaphor for the ultimate resilience of the human spirit. Such food created a heaviness in the stomach, deceiving hunger for several hours. Sometimes pieces of skin were simply chewed for a long time, like chewing gum, to stimulate salivation and muffle the spasms of an empty stomach. This allowed people to distract themselves from thoughts of food and stay sane. Even in this form, the bison continued to serve people, giving itself to the last cell. Eating skin required strong teeth and a healthy stomach, which not all emaciated people had. But the choice was small: either eat skin or die. The ability to see food in a piece of equipment is the highest degree of struggle for life. This reminds us how fragile the line between life and death was in a world without supermarkets. In the next chapter, we will come down from heaven to earth and learn why people ate the earth itself. Geophagy, or eating earth, may seem like a strange and unnatural practice. But for indigenous peoples, it was part of ancient wisdom. It wasn't just any dirt, but specific types of white clay or certain mineral soils. Native Americans knew where such clays were clean and accessible. This clay was collected, dried, and stored as a supplement to the diet, especially during periods of food shortage. It was not food in the usual sense, but it performed important functions in the body of a starving person. First, clay helped fill the stomach, mechanically eliminating painful hunger pangs. This provided temporary relief and allowed the person to sleep or continue on their way. Second, some types of wild tubers and roots that had to be eaten out of hunger contained toxins and bitterness. Clay acted as a powerful absorbent, neutralizing poisons and making plant foods safe for digestion. For example, when eating wild potatoes, Solanum jamesi, which were bitter and poisonous, they were specially dipped in diluted white clay. The clay bound harmful alkaloids, preventing poisoning and stomach pain. This allowed them to expand their diet with plants that would otherwise have been inedible. In this way, the earth became a culinary tool, turning poison into food. In addition, clay was a source of essential minerals: calcium, iron, and magnesium, which were so lacking in the meager diet. Pregnant women often instinctively ate such soil to compensate for the lack of trace elements. It was a natural pharmacy and dietary supplement in one bottle. Deposits of good soil were known and protected, and knowledge about them was passed down from generation to generation. The taste of such clay was chalky, neutral, sometimes slightly salty. It could be dissolved in water to make a cloudy drink, or chewed dry. Of course, it could not replace proteins and carbohydrates, but as an aid to survival, clay was indispensable. It helped to trick the body and hold out until a successful hunt. Surprisingly, the practice of eating clay existed among many peoples of the world, but the Plains Indians perfected its use in combination with wild plants. This is further proof that nothing in nature is superfluous. Even the soil beneath our feet could become an ally in the struggle for life. Have you ever wondered how you could survive in a place where it doesn't rain for months and every plant seems to want to hurt you? For tribes whose territories covered arid southern regions, such as the lands of the Comanche and Apache, the desert was not a dead zone. Their salvation came from plants that at first glance looked hostile and completely inedible. Cacti, especially various species of prickly pear and agave, were real living reservoirs of nutrients and precious moisture for the Indians. The most common savior was the prickly pear, covered with frightening long needles and small, almost invisible thorns. Despite its menacing appearance, this plant offered people juicy fruits and fleshy stems full of water. The main and most difficult task was to get to the desired pulp without getting hurt and without driving hundreds of needles under the skin. This required special dexterity, special tools, and the mandatory use of fire. The fruits and flat paws of the cactus, which were cut off with wooden tongs, were first scorched over a fire. The flames burned away both the large spines and the treacherous small hairs that could cause severe inflammation. Only after this procedure was the juicy, slightly slimy pulp, safe for humans, revealed. It tasted like the cucumber or squash we are familiar with, but with a pleasant, refreshing sourness. This pulp was often eaten raw on the spot to instantly quench thirst on a hot afternoon. However, the Indians also knew how to cook it in soups or bake it on coals, turning it into a hearty side dish. It was an excellent and, most importantly, affordable source of vitamins and moisture in the middle of the arid desert. Even when dried, these products retain their nutritional properties and could be stored for a long time. Another vital plant was mesquite. It is a thorny shrub or small tree that produces an abundant harvest of pods that look like ordinary beans. These pods were very hard and fibrous, making them almost impossible to chew. However, hidden between the seeds inside was a surprisingly sweet and nutritious pulp. The mesquite harvest was an important seasonal event when the pods were collected in huge baskets. Then the women spent hours grinding them in heavy stone mortars, along with the seeds and hard shells. The result was a golden flour with unique properties. Mesquite flour was incredibly nutritious, sweet on its own, and very high in calories. It was actively used to make flatbread, which did not go stale for a long time and provided a lot of energy during expeditions. Refreshing drinks were also made from this flour by simply mixing it with water. Such food was the basis of the diet and allowed people to survive times when hunting was unsuccessful. Mesquite groves were as highly valued by tribes as fruit orchards were by farmers. Agave, often called century plant, was the main source of sugar and a huge amount of calories for the Indians. The most valuable part of the plant was its core, hidden at the base of the rosette of leaves. This core, resembling a huge scaly cone weighing several kilograms, was cut out with special sticks. The process of preparing agave was a real culinary ritual. The cones were baked in deep earthen pits lined with hot stones for several days. The pit was tightly covered with earth, creating the effect of a giant pressure cooker or oven. During the slow simmering process, the tough and inedible fibers of the plant softened. Under the influence of heat, complex starches were converted into simple sugars, making the product incredibly sweet. Baked agave tasted and felt like thick molasses or super sweet baked potatoes. It could be stored for a long time without losing its qualities. It was a real natural energy bar of the past, saving people from exhaustion. A deep knowledge of desert flora allowed the Indians to survive and thrive where, it would seem, there was nothing alive. These plants were reliable, they did not migrate like bison, and they were completely unafraid of drought. They always stood guard over life, ready to give their reserves to those who knew the secret of their complex preparation. For the indigenous people, the desert was not an enemy, but a strict but fair teacher. How do you think you would be able to trust such prickly products and get your dinner from them if you found yourself in an extreme situation? Have you ever wondered what the dark waters of the northern lakes hide, besides fish and algae? In the lake and marshlands historically inhabited by the Dakota and Ojibwe tribes, water was not just a source of drinking water. It hid beneath its surface a rich supply of starch that saved people from starvation. The rhizomes of aquatic plants such as arrowhead, called wapato, and yellow water lily were the Native Americans' equivalent of our potatoes. However, harvesting these underwater roots was backbreaking work that required incredible endurance. Harvesting often required women to wade waist-deep or even chest-deep into the icy autumn water. It was a real test of endurance in the cold, as they had to work for hours. The main tool for searching was not their hands, but their feet. The women carefully felt for the tubers in the soft, muddy bottom with their feet, relying on their sense of touch. Once they found the right root, they deftly pulled it out with their toes, after which the light tuber floated to the surface on its own. The harvested arrowhead tubers were usually the size of a large chicken egg and contained a huge amount of nutritious starch. After harvesting, they were cooked over a fire, most often baked in hot ashes or boiled in water. After heat treatment, they acquired a pleasant, sweet taste, reminiscent of baked potatoes or roasted chestnuts. It was a very satisfying and delicious food that provided a lot of energy. It was available until the water bodies were covered with a thick layer of ice. Sometimes people were lucky and found other people's supplies of these tubers hidden in muskrat huts. These thrifty animals collected wapato for the winter, creating impressive storerooms. Finding such a storehouse was considered great luck, as it greatly facilitated the collection and eliminated the need to go into the water. Of course, when taking a portion, people tried not to completely destroy the nest, but for survival, all means were good. The seeds of the yellow water lily, known as vocus, were also a critically important part of the tribe's diet. They were extracted from large seed pods, which were first collected and then carefully dried. The dried seeds were ground into fine flour using millstones. This flour had excellent culinary properties and was used to thicken meat soups and bake unleavened bread. Working with aquatic plants required not only skill, but also tremendous physical endurance. Cold water quickly drained their strength and body heat, so the gatherers had to take frequent breaks. But the result was worth it, as it was the most stable and reliable source of carbohydrates in the region. While hunting depended on chance and animal migration, aquatic plants were always available. Cattail, which grew thickly along the banks of almost all water bodies, was a real natural supermarket for the Indians. This amazing plant was used in its entirety, depending on the season. Its young, succulent shoots were eaten raw or cooked in early spring, tasting like tender asparagus. In summer, golden pollen was collected and used as an additive to flour for flatbread. But the most valuable part was the fleshy rhizomes, which were usually baked on coals. The roots of cattail contained tough fibers that had to be chewed for a long time or removed during cooking. However, they contained even more pure starch and energy than the potatoes we are familiar with. This plant was easily accessible and recognizable, and it was impossible to confuse it with poisonous herbs. This made cattail the ideal food for survival in any conditions. Even in the depths of winter when the lakes froze over, access to this resource remained. By cutting through the ice with axes and ice picks, it was possible to reach the rhizomes lying at the bottom. Of course, this required enormous effort in the cold and was a task for the most desperate. But in a hungry year, such labor gave the whole family a real chance at life. Waterways fed people no worse than forests rich in game and wide prairies. What do you think? Would you risk going into the icy water for dinner, or would you prefer to look for food on land? Have you ever wondered what helped people survive in the wild steppes long before the advent of agriculture and supermarkets? Hidden among the endless grasses of the prairies was an inconspicuous plant that saved the lives of many generations of indigenous people. We are talking about Sorrellia edulis, also known as prairie turnip or tipsin. This unassuming plant with a tough stem had a deep root covered with a thick protective skin. To the untrained eye, it was just a weed, but to the Indians, it was a real treasure. Finding a dried Sorrellia stem in winter, when everything around was covered with deep snow, was a special skill bordering on art. The stem was the only clue that food was hidden under the layer of frozen ground. Hunters and gatherers knew that these plants rarely grew alone. If they managed to find at least one stem sticking out of a snowdrift, there were likely to be others nearby. This meant that the tribe would not be left without dinner. Harvesting this root was hard physical labor, usually done by women. The root was dug out of hard, often frozen ground with special digging sticks. These tools were made from durable wood and sometimes hardened over a fire for strength. They had to dig quite deep as the valuable tuber was well hidden. Underneath the rough, almost woody dark skin was snow-white, dense flesh. This contrast was always pleasing to the eye, promising satiety. When raw, the flesh was quite hard, but still edible and nutritious. Hunters sometimes ate it on the go to regain strength during long journeys. However, most often the prey was taken to camp for further processing. To preserve the harvest for a long time, the roots were carefully processed. First, they were cleaned of their rough skin, which required patience and dexterity. Then the clean tubers were braided into long, beautiful plaits using their own flexible shoots. These plaits were hung out in the sun, where they dried in the wind until they were completely petrified. In this form, they could be stored for years without losing any of their beneficial properties. Dried prairie turnips were an indispensable ingredient in the nomads' camp kitchen. They were added to rich meat soups and stews, where they worked wonders. In hot water, the hard roots swelled, increased in size, and became surprisingly soft. The taste of this dish was somewhere between sweet carrots and starchy potatoes. In addition, dried roots were often ground in stone mortars, turning them into fine flour. This flour was used to thicken liquid dishes or mixed with fat and berries. It was the most reliable and accessible plant resource for the Plains tribes. Tipsin was their daily bread, which was always at hand, regardless of hunting luck. It was valued for its stability and high-calorie content. Sorrellia was so important for survival that its collection was an integral part of the seasonal calendar. In early summer, when the roots were most succulent, the tribes deliberately stopped in places where it grew. Ignoring the time of harvesting these roots was considered madness and criminal negligence towards the family. People understood that winter would be harsh and prepared for it in advance. It was the dried turnip reserves, hidden in leather bags, that often became the last hope. At the end of long and harsh winters, when game disappeared and meat supplies ran out, these roots saved people from starvation. They provided the necessary energy and vitamins, sustaining life in exhausted bodies. It was a simple but great food, proven over centuries. This humble root has become a true symbol of human foresight and incredible diligence. It reminds us that nature always gives a chance to those who are willing to make an effort and be attentive. Even in the frozen, seemingly empty steppe, life continued thanks to the treasures hidden deep underground. All you had to do was know where to look and not be lazy about digging. Do you think you could rely solely on what you find under your feet to feed your family in winter in the modern world? The history of the survival of the indigenous peoples of North America is a chronicle of incredible resilience and deep knowledge of nature. When the bison disappeared, when the rivers froze over, and when supplies ran low, the people did not give up. They found food in tree bark, rodent burrows, dry grass stalks, and even their own clothing. Their world was not divided into edible and inedible, as we understand it. It was divided into what gives life and what gives nothing. This ability to adapt, to see resources where others see only emptiness, allowed them to thrive in these lands for millennia. Their experience teaches us to respect food and understand the true price of survival. Every morsel of food was obtained through labor, knowledge, and patience. Which of these survival methods did you find most surprising? Could you eat soup made from your own boots to save your life? Suggest topics for future videos you would like to see on our channel in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on new dives into history.